I'm delighted to be asked to come, and I feel it's quite hard to follow what we've already heard, and it's borne out one of the reasons why I accepted the kind invitation, which was that I wanted to come and hear some things and learn some things and be reinforced in my own belief that things don't have to be like this, that there are things that can be done to change the state of imprisonment, and that there is some hope for prison reform. I'm not going to be talking entirely tonight about things that are hopeful or optimistic. And in fact, as Peter was talking, I scrolled through a message I received last week from somebody who was certainly not very happy about things Prison Reform Trust was saying in the newspapers, and had his own view about that, which I'll read to you later, because I think the risk is always at an event of this kind that we talk within a community of interest, and sometimes that needs an interruption or a challenge. So I'll try and bring some of that as well. But essentially, I'm really pleased to be in that community of interest, pleased to be with a group of people who focus their attention on imprisonment and the purpose of imprisonment, and now reimagining imprisonment in a way that I think is hugely important. It does define our society. We've heard about Dostoevsky and how he talked about defining society through the way we imprison people. As someone from a Quaker family, it'll probably strike you as quite odd that I'm going to start by reading what Winston Churchill said about imprisonment, which will be pretty familiar to many people here. But I revisited his speech in 1910 when he was Home Secretary, because we've formed a partnership with the Winston Churchill Trust to create fellowships for people who are going to go overseas, study particular aspects of penal reform, and bring those lessons back to the UK. So hence my interest and my revisiting that particular speech. And I think it was worth doing. So if I might, I wanted to start with how he spoke about imprisonment back then in 1910. What he said was, the mood and temper of the public in regard to the treatment of crime and criminals is one of the most unfailing tests of the civilization of any country. A calm and dispassionate recognition of the rights of the accused against the state, and even of convicted criminals against the state, a constant heart-searching by all charged with the duty of punishment, a desire and eagerness to rehabilitate in the world of industry all those who have paid their dues in the hard coinage of punishment. Tireless efforts towards the discovery of curative and regenerating processes, and an unfaltering faith that there is a treasure, if you can only find it, in the heart of every man. These are the symbols which in the treatment of crime and criminals mark and measure the stored up strength of a nation, and are the sign and proof of the living virtue in it. It'll be very familiar to you. What he said a little later may be slightly less familiar, and I'll return to that, if I might, toward the end of this talk. But to begin with, talking about reimagining imprisonment, I think one of the things, if we're to reimagine imprisonment, is we have to reimagine it within some sort of bounds. What we've heard tonight, and what most people here know, is that prison and prison numbers have exploded, that there's been huge inflation in sentencing. And this is a global issue. I've got the facts and figures for the UK. We've heard about the figures and facts for here in Ireland. And in a sense, I don't want to spray you with facts and figures. I think they're all available. There's certainly very good information available on the International Centre for Prison Studies. And Andrew Coyle will be joining us, I know, later in the week. And there's good information in our Bromley Briefing Prison Fact File. So I'll try and avoid too many facts and figures, but as I said, ever-lengthening sentences, ever-increasing prison numbers. So one of the ways in which we, I think, as penal reformers need to reimagine imprisonment is imprisonment that would be the imprisonment of the few, the loss of liberty for the few. And if we could reimagine prison as the alternative rather than the other way around, that might be a helpful start. People talk about alternatives to custody. If we could see custody as the only alternative when everything else has failed, when measures, including public health measures, we shouldn't restrict ourselves, I think, to measures within the justice system. We should also be thinking about treatment for addictions, enabling people to break away from an addiction that's dragging them down again and again. We need to think about the kind of public health measures that involve social care for people with learning disabilities and learning difficulties, and the kind of mental health treatment that should be available as a matter of course. So as well as community sentences, and what we see, interestingly, certainly in England and Wales, is community sentences beginning to outperform short prison sentences by a factor of almost 10%. So you would think, wouldn't you, that people would say, well, they're very much cheaper, they're very much more effective, and that's clearly the direction that we want to go in. But what I'm interested in exploring with you tonight are what are the things that keep dragging us back to that central focus on prison? Why is prison the thing that's in our lens rather than anything else that might actually be effective, enabling people to get away from offending and to cut crime? Because there are many other ways and many more effective ways. And we've heard some of that already tonight from Peter. So one of the things I wanted to say to you was that our current chair is Lord Wolfe, who of course investigated the disturbances at Strangeways back in 1990. And he's got a great phrase about imprisonment, and he says that we should be focusing on reducing prison numbers to what he calls an unavoidable minimum. And I said to him, what do you mean, unavoidable minimum? Is there a number? And he said, well, you know, for England and Wales, it's probably the number that were in prison when I investigated Strangeways. Now, that number was about 45,000, and today we're looking at a prison population of nearly 87,000 in England and Wales. So we're a very long way from that unavoidable minimum, and I'm not making any excuses for giving a prison reform speech that will focus quite largely on reducing imprisonment, shrinking the justice net, putting prison where it belongs. And this isn't meant to be a critique of those who work in prisons, or indeed a criticism of those who work in prisons, because I think some of the best penal reformers are reforming the system from within it. And they are people who I respect and admire very much. I think they work often in appalling conditions, under great difficulty, but they're the people who are trying to change things from within, trying to bring that humanity and respect into often a very difficult situation indeed. So, but I do think at the heart of prison reform, we're talking about reducing the use of imprisonment, and that's the most positive way of reimagining it. There is always a risk, and certainly there's an expectation on people like Penal Reform International and also Prison Reform Trust that we'll be focused entirely on improving treatment and conditions, and I will make reference to that in a minute. But if you do focus on improving treatment and conditions, unless you establish that principle of last resort, and establish it very firmly indeed, then there is a huge unintended consequence of improving treatment and conditions. How very, very attractive to the courts to be able to say, well, this person needs a detox, and if they go to prison, they'll get that almost immediately. This person needs a mental health assessment, and actually the NHS has taken over prison health and is shortly to do so in Scotland as well. So they will get that assessment, and they'll get that quite quickly. Education has been improved markedly in prisons, so actually a second chance education for young people might be available. There's a big might, because most of us know that prisons are overcrowded and that only the very few will benefit from these particular improvements. But by piecemeal improvements, all of which have been hard fought for and hard won, the risk is always that you create an environment that's seen as essentially rehabilitative, essentially a kind of capacious social service in which we will then happily, or more happily, incapacitate people for longer, as Mary Robinson was saying. Because it's not just that we're imprisoning more people, we're looking at people for considerably longer. And research that's just been published by the Pew Centre in the States, which is probably one of the best examples of inflation in sentencing, shows very clearly that people who were released in 2009, compared to people released 10 years before that, have served on average about 9 months longer, a 36% more a longer sentence than they would have served already. And if you look at figures for sentencing in most European countries, you'll see that stretch in the length of time served. And just purely anecdotally, when we talk to prison staff and visit prisons most weeks, it didn't seem to me so very long ago that when somebody came in to serve a sentence of more than 4 years, that was considered a long sentence. And people would point out and say, well, that person's serving that sentence for this particular thing. That's seen as very commonplace, very commonplace. And the number of life sentence prisoners has really expanded massively. Probably our most fearful experiment, which is now being brought to a close by who I must now call the then Secretary of State for Justice, Ken Clarke, was the indeterminate sentence for public protection, the IPP sentence, which I guess is an example of a Kafkaesque sentence, a sentence that was ill-drafted, brought in far too quickly. Nobody anticipated the kind of ambit it would have. And in fact, Hilary Benn, who was then the prisons minister in England and Wales, was asked in Parliament, well, how many people might receive a sentence of this kind? And said in the House, around 600 people possibly. He said, I really don't know, but it could be as many as 600. Well, today, it's almost 6,500 people who've been given that sentence. 3,500 of them are beyond tariff. And although the sentence itself will be abolished, hopefully later this year, there is a huge now mess of people, of humanity to clear up, to try and respond to. And the only way I think that it could be done fairly and justly would be to consider reversing the burden of proof. The new Secretary of State has the possibility of discretion under the Legal Aid Sentencing and Punishment of Offenders Act in order to respond to the people who are beyond tariff. And I think the fair way would be to say the burden is now on the state. The state must justify continuing detention of these people, because within those 3,500, there will be some people who are extremely dangerous. There will be a handful of people who are extremely dangerous and who, in one way or another, may need to be detained. But the vast majority will have got there because when they were in court, they weren't able to present themselves very well. There's a preponderance of mental health need, again, a preponderance of learning disability within that population. For the women who are serving that sentence, around 80% of them are there for arson or arson-related offences, which again usually has a link with mental health need. So it's a kind of iconic sentence, really. I've raised it tonight because I think it shines a light on the way we see imprisonment and our notion that if only we could do it for longer, if only we could eradicate all risk, then somehow we would improve society and we would have fewer victims. And I think what Peter did for us earlier was to show that that line between victim and offender isn't as clear-cut as many would like to believe, and that very many people who end up within the prison system are themselves victims. If you look at women within the prison system, you see a group of women, most of whom have committed petty, albeit persistent offences, but very many of whom, the majority, are victims themselves of violent crime, of domestic violence, of sexual abuse or rape. So we're not talking about a group of people who are, in general, happy, healthy people who suddenly turn to crime for who knows what reason. We're talking about people who've grown up in a society where they have, in the place that they're in, almost slotted into a career of crime, scarcely by noticing it, really. We did a study of children in prison. We looked at 6,500 children who went in some form of custody, and this was a study led by Mike Huff and colleagues then at King's College and now at Birkbeck. And we were looking at who are these children, and who are the children who end up in some form of custody, and what crimes have they committed that could possibly mean that they need to be detained in that way. I don't think it'll surprise people here to know that around 39% of those children have been on the Child Protection Register. Around 70% were known already to social services. Very high numbers are truanted, very high numbers had experienced parental neglect. Very many had early onset mental health needs, and so on and so forth. I don't have to tell you the story because I think looking at you know the story. The offending profile, again, would be familiar. Not a huge, sudden crime, but a gradual getting into more and more trouble, gradually getting into more and more difficulty, not getting the interventions needed, not getting the support or backup at a time when it could have helped divert them. And there you have that child population. And if you ever want to assure yourself of growing an adult population of the future, then lock up children. Lock up children, because they will be our adult population of the future. And I said I'd talk about hopeful things. One of the hopeful footholds for reform is that in England and Wales, with similar drops, in fact, in Scotland and Northern Ireland too, but I don't know the figures there. But in England and Wales, the number of under 18-year-olds held in the prison system over the last 5 years has dropped by 40%, which is very quiet and very exciting, and has been achieved through a range of methods. We've been privileged to have support of the Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fund to have a programme that is focused entirely on reducing child imprisonment, which has meant that we've been able to work with the high custody local authorities to map out for them what's driving up custody in their particular area, not to publish that, but to hand that back to them, to say, this is what it looks like to us. Here are the drivers to custody, and some of them are so simple, so ordinary, that it's almost embarrassing to relay them to you. But things like communication between people who work in youth offending teams and magistrates, things like failure to provide timely reports to the courts, things like failure to understand what other options might have been available, just things that can actually be put right fairly simply. And with the local authorities we've worked most closely, the drop has been even more marked than the average drop. But the other, of course, big changes in perspective are the Home Office changing police targets so that the police aren't being encouraged to meet their target by dragging as many small people off the streets as possible who are rather easy to find. And the Youth Justice Board consistently working to support that reduction in the number of children entering the justice system at all in the first place, and not using the justice system as a preventative mechanism. And I think it's important that there is a tendency amongst many people involved in reform to want to help people in need. And there is a real risk that by accident they will use the justice system or the resources available within it in order to reach out to those people in need, thus condemning them, I would argue, to a very long-standing period of time in some form of custody or some form of existence within the justice system, which will actually mark them indelibly. And even at a point when community sentences and prison sentences in terms of outcome, short prison sentences in terms of outcome, were running in parallel, so the outcomes were probably quite poor for both. In other words, around half the people reoffending within 1 year of release, or for young offenders very, very much higher than that. I think a case could be made for avoiding prison simply because of that indelible marking process. That if you've served a prison sentence, you are a former prisoner. And I work with colleagues at the Prison Reform Trust who've spent time themselves in prison, and they sometimes say, at what point am I no longer a former prisoner? At what point do I lose that identity and become another sort of person? The punishment of imprisonment, as we've heard time and again tonight, is about loss of liberty. It's not meant to be about loss of identity. It's not meant to be about loss of hope for the future. And yet only about a third of people leave prison with a job to go to, any kind of training course to go to. Very many leave homeless, and very many leave in a position where they are going to be disadvantaged. And it shouldn't surprise any of us that the reconviction rates are so high. Criminologists have written about this time and again. And in Michael Tonry, who sadly can't be with us on this programme, in his edited book about punishment that the Chicago Press published, there's an article there by Jean-Paul Radieux, who said, punishment is the one policy that is never discredited by its failure to meet its stated objectives. If it fails to meet its goals, the only reason is that there's not enough of it. And there is that feeling that it's punishment and more punishment and punishment on stilts. And we've seen in the last few years an introduction of a penal reform programme by Ken Clarke when he came in as Justice Secretary, which even before he left, yesterday I think it was beginning to be changed in the telling. New words were being introduced. And it will be interesting to see what actually ends up in the Crime and Courts Bill, because the last consultation on community sentencing and on the probation service was absolutely peppered with the word punitive. And some people, politicians will say, or certainly civil servants will say, well, we have to put this kind of, this gloss on it, this what I would describe as an acid wrap. We have to wrap it around in these words because then it'll be more palatable to the public. And then we can do reform in that kind of a way. And the question would be, well, does it matter? Does the language of punishment matter? And I'd say to you, yes, it does. It matters hugely. The way we describe crime and punishment, the way we describe imprisonment, is really important in terms of how we see ourselves as a society. But it's also really important in terms of the people on the receiving end of those punishments and the people who are employed on our behalf to try and manage that environment. So the language, the punitive language that's been developing, is damaging. The other language that's been developing and parallel with it, the language of the market, I'd argue is similarly devaluing and demoralising. So the stock and flow of prisoners, which we here refer to, the movement of people in terms of overcrowding, in other words, stock and flow, the creaming and parking of people we hear about in relation to various commissioned pieces of work, so that you would park someone who might not meet your objectives, and you'd cream off those who would, because then you'll get your payment by results. And there are a lot of new kind of market words and market values that are permeating the system that, again, I noticed in the programme will be addressed in this conference, and I'm very glad to see that they will be. Because if we're looking at what are the risks to penal reform, it's that kind of juggernaut that seems to be driving behind us that I think we need to look out for. But I said I wanted to talk about some of the hopeful things, so I won't dwell on those things. What are the things that can happen, that can change? Well, one of the things that's really important in a conference about Europe is to think about regulating the environment. I've talked a bit about shrinking it, trying to make it that unavoidable minimum. Regulating the environment, reducing harm, increasing safety for those arguably few who need to be held behind bars for a period of time. And again, for the shortest time necessary. Mary Robinson referred to international standards and scrutiny. And a colleague at Prison Reform Trust, Dr. Kimit Edgar, who's head of our research, has been working with Quakers on the National Preventative Mechanisms and OPCAT, which you'll know the Universal Declaration of Human Rights prohibits torture and any other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. Under the optional protocol to the Convention, each state is obliged to establish a national preventative mechanism. Now, most states are doing that. The requirements of the NPMs are they need to be functionally independent, with independent personnel. They need to have sufficient expertise, gender balance, adequate representation of minorities, that they're provided with the necessary resources. In Europe, an NPM network was established in 2009 to promote cooperation amongst NPMs. In some countries like France, they've created a post to inspect places of custody. Other places, Spain, Georgia, Denmark, have assigned the NPM role to their ombudsman. And in the UK, the Prisons Inspectorate coordinates a large network of NPM bodies. The Prisons Inspectorate, in addition to their obligations under OPCAT, have created, with the help of the World Health Organization, drawing on its work on healthy prisons, 4 tests of a healthy prison. And again, in terms of thinking about reimagining prison, if we accept that prison may exist, unless we're abolitionist entirely, then how would a healthy prison look? The inspectorates say that their 4 tests are safety, that prisoners, particularly the most vulnerable, are held safely, respect, that prisoners are treated with respect for their human dignity, purposeful activity, that prisoners are able and expected to engage in activity that's likely to benefit them, and lastly, resettlement. Prisoners are prepared for release into the community and help to reduce the likelihood of reoffending. In relation to safety, there is an unusual opportunity now, and an unusual gap, I guess, in terms of the UN standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners. Because the Bangkok rules have been ratified now by the UN, and the Bangkok rules focus entirely on women, unplugged a gap in those standard minimum rules where women were scarcely mentioned at all. They now have their own set of rules, which covers not only imprisonment, but also community penalties. And the Bangkok rules, talk about violence against women and the specific implications for women's contact with the justice system. And they talk about physical and psychological safety. When you look back at the standard minimum rules, which were agreed in 1955, you find no such reference to safety. So there is the opportunity now, and arguably a once-in-a-generation opportunity, to revisit those rules and to establish protection from harm, and to make sure that prison authorities ensure the safety of prisoners, staff and visitors. And that's something I think that Andrew Coyle's engaged in at the moment and probably will be addressing later this week. So one of the things that we can look forward to is better regulation of prisons. Prisons that so easily, without that regulation, are the places that nobody sees, the places that are beyond scrutiny or just simply out of sight. And if you look at ways in which local boards can operate, like the independent monitoring boards, for example, if you look at the role of inspectorates, you look at the role of ombudsman, you look at the role now of the UN rules and OPCAT, and you can see the way in which we can create a set of concentric circles around imprisonment, which ensures at least for that environment that it can be the humane and decent place we expect it to be. If you focus for a minute on improving treatment and conditions, and that comes with a health warning that I've given earlier, then you can see that there are certain things that can be done, things that can put matters right that are entirely practical. And sometimes when we're working at Prison Reform Trust, we really need, I think, for ourselves, the succour of some sort of practical changes, some things that aren't about ideology, not even about policy, but it's purely practical changes. So I wanted to give you one example of one that just took years to do and now has had an impact across the UK. We were told through our Advice and Information Service that responds to about 6,000 prisoners a year that prisoners' phone charges were absolutely astronomically high and very unfair, 6 times higher than they would be for someone using a phone outside. At the same time, people who know about family contact and good family contact will know that it reduces the risk of further offending by a factor of about ×6. So it made little sense on a number of grounds, whether it was to do with surviving a sentence and having contact with your family, or whether it was saying to the authorities, actually, this is a good thing because it will help your agenda of reducing reoffending. And BT at that point had established networks in prisons and effectively has established a kind of cartel. So we started with BT and said to them, your phone charges are 6 times higher than outside. Would you reduce those? And they said no, in very politely and over a long period of time, but they weren't going to do that. So we tried a range of tactics that seemed to take, as I said, forever. And one of the tactics was a page in the Financial Times, as I remember it, exposing this and saying how unfair it was, talking to the Director General of the Prison Service, talking to the chairman of BT, and in the end what actually achieved it was an interesting route, and I think it's got some bearing on what we're talking about in terms of reimagining imprisonment. It was to go the consumer route. It was to say, actually, people in prison are people. They may be behind bars, they may have lost their liberty, but they haven't lost the fact that they're people, so they're consumers of services. And they find themselves now in a situation where they're consumers of services where they have no choice. And we took a case with the Consumer Council in each of the different countries within the UK and won it, which meant that there was a marked reduction, about a half reduction in the calls to mobile phones, and some reduction in the cost to landlines. But it was that kind of iconic, who are these people? And who represents them, and can they represent themselves? That's an important question. And of course, on a bigger stage, you can look through that same lens when you're talking about prisoners voting and the absolute resistance within the Westminster Parliament to operate a judgment which was passed in 2004 in the John Hurst case, when it was declared unlawful that the blanket ban on prisoners voting was declared unlawful. But we are still waiting and working on that particular decision, and it is something that is being resisted. And for those who've read the parliamentary debate, it flushed out some very grim and unacceptable views about people in prison. But the reason it's waiting is the reason, in part, why we have such high numbers in prison, that this toxic mix between politicians who found that talking tough on crime is a way of winning votes, and the media who found that advertising the worst crimes is a way of selling papers and selling media space. And that really is a very toxic mix. And Douglas Hurd, who's our president, when I said to him, well, could you think back at a time when you were Home Secretary, there were far fewer people in prison? And he said, yes, but it wasn't a big political issue then. But nowadays, every step is charted and every step is observed. And I think it will be very difficult for the new Secretary of State, who will probably see us through to a next election, not to live up to a reputation that he's been variously given by members of the press. Attack dog, jackal, I think these are the names that have been used. And yet actually when you look at speeches he made when he was Shadow Home Secretary, he's talked about the need to resort to public health measures, the need to deal with addictions. He's talked about the importance of working across departments, essentially presaged that important message about we will not solve the problems of imprisonment by looking within prison. Those solutions do not lie largely behind prison walls. They lie largely within communities. They lie within housing, within education, within work, within families. And that message can't be stated enough. Because if we're reimagining imprisonment, we had to bring prison back into communities. We have to find a place to integrate it. And it has to be smaller. Smaller in our minds and smaller in number. So where does that take us? I mentioned earlier on about capacious social service. There are some particularly vulnerable people, and again, Peter's alluded to them, so I won't talk for long about this, but particularly vulnerable people who've ended up in the prison system. And again, a foothold for hope, which may or may not hold in terms of now England and Wales because of changes in health, but we're hopeful that they will. In part because of the Bradley Review of Mental Health and Learning Disability, and in part because of the Women's Institute, which has had a very powerful campaign called Care Not Custody. There's been an agreement between Health and Justice to set aside 50 million for diversion schemes in police stations and courts across the country, and that those in every police station and every court across England, because health in Wales is devolved, by 2014. That would mean that people on arrival would have an assessment if that were thought to be needed and could be diverted into the treatment that so many people need. If the offending is so serious that they're going to stay on in the justice system, then the treatment will follow them through the system. That would make a very big difference, a very big difference. What else would make a difference? The new remand clause within the Legal Aid and Sentencing Act, which says very clearly if someone is facing no real prospect of imprisonment in terms of their offence seriousness, then why would you hold them on remand? So the no real prospect test, which magistrates will have to apply from early next year onwards, will reduce numbers on remand. There are particular groups where you can see needless use of imprisonment, which could be gradually reduced. And that pre-trial detention, which is a global issue, is one of the groups where we don't hold people as long as many countries do, but we do hold too many people for little reason. If you look at breach, that's another whole area, breach of community sentences and breach of civil orders. But what I wanted to do was to say, okay, we're not alone in this. We do have some enemies, and that was something I wanted to bring in before the end, because I felt people will say, yes, we're a community of interest, we agree on so much. And I think we do agree on so much. And I think people in power agree in a way that I never realised when I first arrived at the Prison Reform Trust. I think I thought that much of the job would be somehow gathering information about some of the unfairnesses, some of the vulnerable groups, some of the things that had happened almost by default in terms of an exploding prison population, and that once those were delivered to the people in power, whether they were politicians or whether they were in the judiciary, those people would act to change things. I think that's very naive. I think they know it already. I think the film I'm going to show you in a minute will show you that. It's not that people don't know it. It's just that it's very difficult to undo a pretty major wrong that's been running now for about 15 years. But that's the wrong we're trying to undo. And the way we can undo it, I think, is by bringing together people who you're going to hear from, yourselves, and in discussions that you're going to have, looking at new ways of looking at not just imprisonment, but new ways of looking at justice. And there are footholds for reform. So the reduction in child imprisonment, which is something that, as I said, has happened here, but it's also happened in some other countries. The reduced use of prison in some countries compared to ourselves. If you look across to Denmark, 63 in 100,000 people are held within prison. In France, it's 115, it's 83 in Germany, but in England and Wales, it's 155. So it's a sad thing, in a way, asking someone who spends most of her life in the UK in relation to penal reform to talk to a group here, because many other European countries can tell us a lot about a much more sparing use of imprisonment. So I think we've got a lot to learn. But I think there are some enemies creeping up behind us, and one of those is the growing level of competition within the system and privatisation. So I want to return to that just briefly. If we look at that level of competition, it does a number of things. One of the things it does, very meanly, is it squashes any sharing of good practice. So it's the antithesis to an event like this, really, which is about sharing good practice and talking about what can change. If you want to have a competitive edge, you don't share what you know best, what you do best. You simply put it into your bid. If you want to demoralise a public service, you not only cut its budget to the bone, but you ask it to compete, often in a competition that doesn't feel as if it's on a level playing field. And you create, as I said earlier, a language of marketisation that kind of mystifies what should be an ordinary common sense debate about crime and punishment and use of imprisonment. There is a mitigating factor here, and that is the cost. And again, Peter mentioned the cost of an individual going to prison. Because the economic situation in Europe is so dire, we probably can't afford any longer to have this huge prison population. Now, I think most of us would prefer a humanitarian argument. Most of us would probably prefer hearts to wallets in terms of what's going to actually make the changes. But if you do look across to the States, we've got a lot of negative learning from them, but also some positive learning now about prisoner re-entry, about desistance, about ways of looking at how do you begin to reduce an unacceptably expensive prison population. And many penal reformers in the States are pragmatists. And I think they've accepted the idea that prison reform may be achieved through economic analysis and economic argument. And I think I've become a bit more of a pragmatist. Yes, of course, it would be right to win on hearts and minds. But it's better to win. It's better to reduce that number down to an unavoidable minimum. It's better not to put that indelible mark on quite so many people. And if the way we do it is to say we can't afford to do this anymore, I think we can't afford to do it emotionally, but many would say we can't afford to do it economically. And I promised before I showed the film I'd return to what Churchill said, and I want to do that because it was interesting, and it links to what he said and he reminded politicians about back in 1910 when he was talking about improving treatment and conditions. And he said, "When the doctors and the chaplains and the prison visitors have come and gone, the convict stands deprived of everything that a free man calls life. We must not forget that all these improvements, which are sometimes salves to our consciences, do not change that position." And I think we're not here for the few days to salve our consciences. We have to remember what that total loss of liberty means to people. And I think he put it so very well. We must not forget that all these improvements, which are sometimes salves to our consciences, do not change that position. So I am going to show you a very short film we made, partly just simply to say, look, actually a lot of people think that things can be different. A lot of people think that it doesn't have to be like this. Some of them are usual suspects, some of them are less usual suspects. Some of them are people who, if they came together and used the power they have, could actually make things different. I also said that I would remind us that not everybody agrees with us. So I have flipped it up on my phone, which was sent to me last week by one of my colleagues when I was on holiday, kindly. This was when we had a press release out about overcrowding, which actually was carried in every newspaper, I think, every national paper. And we were pleased. It was a good chance to use the bank holiday to say to people, don't forget that prisons are overcrowded. It's become a fact of life. People think of it as normal. It isn't normal. It isn't right. It's not productive, and it's painful for people. So this person, who kindly has given his name and hasn't written particularly aggressively, actually, compared to some we get, but I want to read it to you because it's an articulate way of saying what some believe. I've just read the comments of your director, Juliet, Lyon, with regard to overcrowding in prisons. What a load of rubbish this liberal do-gooder whinges on about. She is totally off track and a complete idiot. Instead of being concerned with prisoners' problems, she should tackle the problems faced by the victims of crime. The majority of inmates are scum and deserve to be locked up, not mollycoddled by anal retentives such as your organisation and its director. You are a disgrace. In your spiel about overcrowding, you failed to mention the reintroduction of capital punishment. This would free up places in our prisons. Longer, not shorter sentences are required for those found guilty, and a strict regime of hard labour should be reintroduced to ensure that inmates are not just lounging around with their TVs, music, videos, etc. Prison should not just be about deprivation of liberty. It should hurt, both mentally and physically. I served in the Royal Navy and MOD for 40 years, served this country, fought wars, and this has unfortunately meant protecting people like you and your organisation. I wish I hadn't bothered. It's terribly sad. It's very clear. It's very sad, a very angry and a very bitter person, but a person who I think has laid out very clearly the views of some. I think it is only the views of some, but I think we need to bear in mind that there are some people who hold these views and hold them very strongly, and he was kind enough to bother to write all of that down. But when we do public opinion polling, I don't want to end on that before the film, when we do public opinion polling, we do find something different. 4 weeks after the riots last summer, we with ICM did a poll of 1,000 people across the UK to see how they were feeling about crime and punishment, expecting, I fear, the worst. It was remarkable how many were interested in restorative justice, how many were interested in reparative solutions to crime. Vast majority said that they wanted people to account for what they'd done to victims. The vast majority could see that there were measures like treatment for addictions, mental health care, better supervision by parents of young people would help prevent crime and disorder in future. I'm talking about numbers ranging between 80 and 90%. So when I say the vast majority, I mean the vast majority. And it was very heartening to see that. I think there is much more public appetite than people assume for a change of direction. I think there will be the few people who are furious and who feel that just more punishment, that's all we need. We just need more punishment. But there are others who can see that actually it's a cul-de-sac, that for the people we punish, and Peter put this much more clearly than I did, they know what punishment is. Punishment has been most of their lives. They know what punishment is. They're quite resilient to punishment, some of them. Some of them will be beaten down by it eventually, but others will just not even feel it in the way that many others will, because punishment has been part of their lives. What hasn't been part of their lives is restoration, has been reparation, has been actually gaining that insight that helps you see how somebody else feels about something. There are strands of that can be found even within a prison. They can be found in restorative justice conferences in prison. They can be found in the work of Samaritan listeners in prison. They do exist there, but where they would flourish is outside in the community. If you look across to Northern Ireland and the work that it does with under 18-year-olds, the success of restorative justice there, which has reduced child prison numbers markedly. Victim satisfaction there is running at over 90%. Very high attendance at case conferences in relation to restorative justice. And that is the integrated and main way of dealing with under 18-year-olds. So, not very far away, and something important to learn from that. So I agree very much with what Peter said about restorative justice. It's there, I think, we need to look to hope, that feel of reparation, of restoration. If we only look at punishment, it darkens our lives, as well as the lives of the people that we've been talking about tonight. So I want to show you a film to finish, which is just, we called it Talking Justice, Talking Sense. We interviewed a while ago now, a few people who are in different positions within the justice system, just to get them to say something about what they felt would make for more sense and more justice. So if I could show you that. Thank you.
Prison should be a place not of first resort, but of last resort. And there are many other ways I think you can deal with offenders other than cutting them off from the world.
Prisons have become warehouses of our social problems. What we are doing in this country currently is sending people to prison, many of whom are victims themselves, many of whom have been bullied and will continue to be bullied in prisons.
I think prison needs to be reserved for Britain's most dangerous offenders. It shouldn't become a big private industry that trades on people's misery. It shouldn't be an alternative welfare state where the vulnerable, the mentally ill and the illiterate founder away for years on end with no hope of any real rehabilitation.
With people with learning difficulties, there's definitely no help there in courts, and I've been in quite a few of them. You know.
My first time in prison was actually the same as Danny's. I was down for non-payment of fine. But of course it wasn't told me properly, or I couldn't understand properly about payment of fines. My learning disability was late diagnosed as well. I didn't know I had a learning disability when I was going through most of the criminal justice system.
We need to look at ways of stopping kids that commit petty crimes going to prison and then going on to become lifetime criminals. I was brought up in an estate in North London. Like, you were surrounded by people that had no aspirations. And I went to university, I went to LSE, and I was surrounded by people that knew they wanted to work for Goldman Sachs since they were 10. People where I'm from have never heard of Goldman Sachs, and just stuff like that, just information available to kids that you don't have to go down that path, you can go down this path.
For 40 years I've been involved with a day centre which works with young homeless people in central London, and for them prison simply does not work. Of course, when you have a young person in complete crisis, nowhere to go, family rejection, no local authority involvement, very often prison's a fantastic dumping place, but it's amazingly expensive, and of course it pollutes the young person. They come into contact with extremely dangerous individuals. But I've never really seen any young person go to jail and come out of it a better individual.
The most dangerous people, criminals who commit serious crimes, once convicted, should be locked up for the safety of the citizens we are charged with protecting. But I think at the other end of the equation, the majority, the overwhelming majority of people we deal with who are convicted benefit from sentences which are not custodial. The evidence is clear, especially around young people, where they are given sentences, sanctions that are within the community against which they have offended. The chances of a long-term successful outcome are far higher.
There are alternatives, and these are being demonstrated in other countries, but we seem so fascinated, obsessed with locking people up in this country from a very early age, and for quite minor offences, that we lose sight of the fact that prison should be for serious offenders, and only that justifies the expense.
We would like to see wider use of alternatives to custody so that we can tackle reoffending behaviour and help offenders rehabilitate themselves.
The judge's job is to do everything possible to avoid sending somebody who's been convicted of a crime to prison. There are all sorts of alternatives to prison that the judge can use, provided that the offence is not so serious that prison is the only answer.
Is prison the answer? Well, for some of the people I see in prison, if prison's the answer, it seems to me we're not asking the right questions. When I see people who are mentally disordered, seriously self-harming, some of the children and young people I see in prison, it's quite clear that whatever their problem is, prison is likely to make it worse rather than better.
I've committed somewhere in the region of probably 20,000 crimes in my life. and spent 18.5 years of my life in prison. Prison never worked for me, restorative justice did.
I'm Will Riley, I'm Peter's last victim. I did find Peter in my house, I caught him, he was convicted, and I saw him again 6 weeks later under restorative justice. And I met him, and I told him what I thought about it, the whole process. And I was able to completely get rid of the trauma of being a victim.
To meet a victim face to face for the first time ever just is something, it's the hardest thing I've ever done, yet the most rewarding.
At the moment we have a detected reoffending rate of those who go through the criminal justice system into prison and out the other end. And that can't be right. We're wasting our time as police officers actually dealing with those people again and again. And so the question I ask politicians is, how many times do you want us to arrest offenders before they're dealt with effectively in what is at the moment a failing criminal justice system, and prison in particular?
Your perennial problem is why we feel that comparatively minor offenders, comparatively minor shoplifting, for instance, is a non-violent crime, I suppose. Why should they be penalised with prison? Why are we putting so many people in prison that maybe could be dealt with in a more creative way?